Today's webinar is called Secured Connectivity Across Firewalls. It's really about firewall setup in order to successfully use remote.it in a secure environment. Okay, this is today's agenda. I won't read it off to you, but this is an outline of where we're going. Who should be watching this webinar? This is a list of people that are typically interested in this topic. In order to get the most out of this webinar, you should know how to configure your firewall in your router, or if you have a separate firewall device, which some people in enterprise situations do. The reason that you need to know this is that firewall setup is all different, and so I am not going to show specifically any firewall user interface for setup. You should have already configured remote.it services on your devices. You should know how to make a proxy connection through the remote.it web portal or using API calls. And you should also know or have had some experience making peer-to-peer connections using either the remote.it desktop application or using the command line. So the easy way to allow remote.it to work properly on your system is to configure your target side firewall to pass all UDP ports to all locations. Now, this may not be possible, but by default, many consumer routers are configured this way. So if you're just setting something up at home so that you can access it from a remote location or your cell phone or something like this, you may not actually have to do anything. And we don't really suggest that you change your firewall settings if remote.it is currently working. However, if you want to lock down your firewall as much as possible for security reasons, you will want to know the information we're going to be discussing here. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the remote.it chat server. The remote.it chat server is part of our infrastructure. And when your target device starts up, it maintains a periodic communication, sort of like a heartbeat or ping. It's not literally a ping, but it periodically sends a message up to the chat server saying, I'm here and I'm alive. And when you have communication between the target device and the chat server, then your device will appear online in the remote.it portal or in the desktop application. And over here on the left are some things that you can do when you're first setting your device up. And these messages apply both to people who've installed the software on their device using either the remote.it package or the Connectivity package. And I'm not going to describe the differences between that, but even if you're using the remote.it package, it does have the Connectivity daemon in it, and these commands will work. And this is sort of some debugging information, but it will give you information about the nature of your firewall. And we'll talk a little bit more about debugging a little bit later. So the first scenario of making a proxy connection is typically when you're in the remote.it web portal and you click on links there and make connections. These are proxy connections because they send the data through a proxy server maintained by remote.it. And if you have set up a reverse proxy, which is a connection to a HTTP or HTTPS web server, it will launch in your browser using this form, and this is a random string followed by an indication of one of our reverse proxy servers, but there's no port indication on it. And then a port proxy, which is used for all other TCP service connection types, returns both a proxy URL and then a randomized port in the range from 20,000 to 40,000. So you've probably seen these if you've been using the remote.it web portal. And this is a full diagram showing your client connection. Initially, it will make a connection to the target device through the chat server to make sure that the device is online and get some information about that. And then once the connection is established, your data is actually going through the remote.it proxy server. And the proxy servers are geolocated, meaning that our chat server will pick one in your region to make the connection. So if you've made a number of proxy connections, typically you'll see that, the proxy number will change, sometimes depending on where you are. Proxy 19, proxy 51. There are several in most geolocations, so that will sometimes change. And then in order for the proxy server to actually work, you need to allow outgoing UDP over here in the target firewall from port 20,000 to 40,000 to a short list of proxy servers in your region. And at that point, you'll be able to make a proxy connection. And so the settings that you need to make here will be to allow outgoing UDP on ports 59 to 5970. And then we have a whitelist of URLs of proxy servers for the full 20,000 to 40,000 range. And I'm not going to include that list in this webinar, but if you send an email to support@remote.it requesting just put firewall in the subject line and I'll know what you're talking about, but I will send you a full list of all of the proxy servers that we have around the world. And then you can use that with your IT department to configure your firewall. Scenario number 2 is for P2P or peer-to-peer connections. And peer-to-peer connections are made when you click on a service name in the remote.it desktop application, which we've recently released, or if you use the Connectivity binary in a P2P initiator mode. And this would be something you'd do if you wanted to build your own application using remote peer-to-peer connectivity, or have a script that you wrote that somehow used a peer-to-peer connection. And peer-to-peer connections use local host addresses such as 127.0.0.1 or 127.0.0.2. And the port which will be used for this connection is specified by you at the time that the connection is configured, meaning set up in the desktop app. And this top line where I say legacy SSH, when I set up this connection in the desktop, I chose port 33,000 as the port, or initiated ConnectD in the P2P initiator mode. What you see down at the bottom here is a ConnectD. It's actually connectd.exe. This indicates it's being run on Windows, but this is a command line that you use or could use to initiate a peer-to-peer connection in a Windows command prompt box, and the T parameter specifies the port that you're going to use. So here I say ConnectD, all this other stuff, and this is documented at the docs.remote.it, so I'm not going to explain all of this now. But the T33000 is equivalent to this port assignment 33,000, and you can also see that we have the 127.0.0.1 bind address. So as with proxy connections, the target device has to maintain connection with the chat server. We still have the chat server involved for both peer-to-peer and proxy connections, and this is just the same as before. Nothing's changed here. But once you make the connection goes directly from the client firewall to the target firewall. So there's no proxy server in the middle. And so the port in use here between the two ends is going to be the port used by the P2P initiator. You can also whitelist, if you want, the public IP of the P2P initiator. This is probably really, let's put it this way. If you're going to allow outgoing UDP to the port used by the P2P initiator, let's suppose your client PC is a laptop and it can move from place to place, then that would be one way to do it. You just say, okay, I'm going to whitelist traffic on this port to any endpoint, and if my client PC is sometimes one place and sometimes another place, to the extent that it would actually have a different public IP, that would work. Or in the case where your client PC is like in an office and it's always going to have the same external public IP, you could whitelist the public IP of the P2P initiator. And if you're behind a proxy server on your client side that only allows TCP traffic, and a lot of times these are set up just to limit people in a business to only be able to access web servers and prevent them from doing, shall we say, video streaming or other things besides just going to web servers, then you're only going to be able to make a proxy connection to target services which were configured to use a reverse proxy. And reverse proxy are only used for web servers. And I'm just showing you, if you're using the Connect-D package on your device, you'll set up the option to HTTP on port 80. I believe there's also a, just below this, you can see secure web HTTPS on port 443. You'd use that if you were connecting to a HTTPS server, or if you're using the remote.it package, which includes the desktop or web admin panel. When you configure that service, you're going to use one of these choices, the HTTP or HTTPS reverse proxy. All right, now we're going to look at some debugging strategies. If you're debugging connections and you're using the desktop, for example, which currently only works in peer-to-peer mode, sometimes you might get a failure, most likely when your target device is on a cellular data connection. And sometimes what you can do if that happens is try a proxy connection as well. And sometimes proxy connections will work where peer-to-peer connections fail. If you're having trouble using these instructions, or you've followed them as well as you can and you're still having trouble, then you can run these two commands on the device: connect-d-in, and then route the output to nat-debug.txt. And another more thorough test that gives us information about the NAT and its timing is connect-d -nat, and these two arrows here just append those results onto the end of nat-debug.txt. Then you can send this file to us at the support@remote.it email address, and we can analyze that and try to figure out if there's something unusual about the NAT at your target location. Here we have some questions that people have asked in the past. And the first one is it possible to use the UDP port range 5959 to 5970 for connections? And as I already told you, 5959 to 5970 UDP is already used for the chat server. And the answer to this is that yes, if you're using peer-to-peer connections. And then what you would do is you would make sure that you specify a port in this range when initiating or configuring the peer-to-peer connection. In the previous example, I showed the value of 33,000, but if you wanted to just have this one range open, then you could also make connections in this range. Another question that comes in often is, I'm using a mobile hotspot, also known as a cellular data connection, for the target side internet connection. What should I do? Well, the reason people ask this is because a lot of times in this case, there is no way to adjust the firewall or port settings. So I say it should not be necessary to do anything. However, I did previously say that there are some cellular NAT configurations that prevent peer-to-peer connections. So as I said earlier, if you're having a problem with a peer-to-peer connection and there's a mobile hotspot on the target side, and sometimes also this would apply to mobile hotspot or a cellular data connection from the client, that you should double check using a proxy connection through the remote.it web portal. And another question that comes in sometimes, my target device is behind a proxy server that only passes TCP. What should I do? And the reality is that unfortunately, remote.it requires UDP and will not work in this scenario.
And so the question is, in the peer-to-peer connection model, is there still the need to enable connections to the chat servers? If yes, from where? Initiator, target, or both? And the answer is yes. The chat servers always need to be allowed connection to. That is the actual command and control data coming between the endpoints, your device, and the initiator to initiate connections, whether they are proxy connections or peer-to-peer connections. Okay, the question is, I am using public Wi-Fi to stream CCTV video. Should I set up a P2P direct connection? That's the question. The public Wi-Fi does not allow port forwarding for security reasons. I can to a Raspberry Pi VNC using service ports. Is P2P direct connection the way to go?
For streaming video, peer-to-peer connection is, unless your video is very low bandwidth, the peer-to-peer connection is in fact the preferred answer, because since the data is not being diverted to go through one of our proxy servers, you get the best bit rate possible by using a peer-to-peer connection. As far as public Wi-Fi, it wasn't clear to me if the public Wi-Fi was on the client or the target, but this is one of those situations where if, for example, the public Wi-Fi firewall was set to block all UDP, you would have a problem. So let's put it this way. If you set this up and test it and it works, it means that those UDP ports are open. If you set this up and it doesn't work, then you may have an issue, because you may need to deal with the people who are managing that public Wi-Fi to open up those ports.
In my experience, 99 out of 100 times on most public Wi-Fi, this would work no problem, either initiator or target side.
Okay, somebody asked, what techniques are used to prevent P2P? It isn't so much that P2P is blocked. It is not actually due to a specific desire to block P2P. And again, I'm going to have to go back to engineering to get the full details on this, but there are some types of NAT topologies, such as symmetric NAT, that will interfere with the way remote P2P connections are made. And what I can say is that it's simply an attribute of the NAT topology, and it's a combination of the NATs at both client and target side that can do this, but it's not really intended to block P2P, at least I don't think so, by the operators. It's simply a side effect of the way our technology works with respect to those types of NATs. So that's the end of the presentation. There's some more resources here that you can consult if you have questions about remote.it. Support at remote.it is a place where you can email. You can also use the little blue support widget that you'll see in various locations in the web portal. When you're logged in, send a support ticket. Let us know if you're having trouble with anything, and we'll try to get you fixed up.